Your use of the word apologize feels very extreme and very forced to me.
For wives, one piece of land. And when it all finally ended, the checks didn't come out equal. That's the story tonight, but this isn't just about land, and it's not just about money. This is about what happens when a family spends years building a dream that only exists in speeches, in promises, and in carefully filmed conversations, but never actually in real life. Because Coyote Pass was never just property. It was the closest thing this family ever had to proof on paper. Everything else in the Brown family world was built on emotion, faith, and belief systems that couldn't be measured. Love was supposed to be equal. Time was supposed to be shared. Attention was supposed to be balanced. But land? Land doesn't care about any of that. Land has numbers. Land has ownership records. Land has a final sale price. And when Coyote Pass was finally sold, all of those years of "we're equal" had to survive something they had never been tested against before: math. Let's slow down and really understand what this place was supposed to be. Coyote Pass was roughly 14 acres of raw Arizona land purchased after the family's move to Flagstaff. On the surface, it looked like a fresh start, a blank canvas. But in reality, it was sold as something much bigger than that. It was supposed to be the physical version of their belief system. For wives. For homes. One shared property. A single space where the entire plural family would finally stop living scattered across separate houses and start living the life they always said they wanted, together, side by side, unified under one vision. That was the promise. That was the plan. And for a while, it was also the story they kept repeating to themselves and to the world watching. But here's where things start to fracture. Because a dream like that only works if everyone is actually moving in the same direction at the same time. And Coyote Pass was already carrying tension long before a single house was built. Plans changed. Arguments started. Designs were debated and redebated. Some wanted separation. Some wanted closeness. Some wanted one large shared structure. Others wanted independence and space. And slowly, without anyone announcing it directly, the unity that the land was supposed to represent started to disappear. What was left behind wasn't a building site. It was empty ground. Year after year, the cameras rolled, conversations happened, meetings were held, but the land stayed exactly the same. No foundations. No shared homes. Just dirt, plans, and rising frustration. And that empty space started to mean something else entirely. It stopped looking like a future, and started looking like a delay. A pause button on a dream that nobody could agree how to press play on anymore. Because while the land sat untouched, the family holding it was changing. Relationships were shifting. Distance was growing. And the very unity Coyote Pass was supposed to represent was quietly breaking apart in real time. And that is where this story really begins. Not with the sale. Not with the numbers. But with the moment a shared dream stopped moving forward, and everyone started realizing maybe it was never going to. And once that realization starts to settle in, that the dream isn't just delayed, but possibly never coming, the land stops feeling like hope and starts feeling like pressure. Because Coyote Pass was never just empty property. It was a financial commitment tied directly to emotional promises. Money was spent with the expectation that it would turn into something permanent, visible, and shared. But when nothing gets built, the question changes shape. It's no longer, what are we building? It becomes, why haven't we built anything yet? And in a family like this, that question doesn't stay quiet for long. Every meeting about the land starts circling the same problems. Who owns what portion? Who is responsible for what cost? Who gets which piece of the future if the future actually happens? And slowly, the conversation stops being about architecture and starts being about ownership. Because ownership is where emotion meets reality. This is where the ideal of one family, one shared vision runs straight into something much colder: paperwork. Titles. Legal names. Financial contributions that don't always match emotional expectations. And that mismatch is where tension grows. Some voices in the family are focused on building quickly, trying to turn the land into something real before everything falls apart. Others are more cautious, questioning whether the plan is even financially realistic in the first place. For homes, or even one large shared structure on raw desert land, is not a small project. It requires infrastructure, permits, utilities, grading, construction costs, all of it stacked on top of a family that is already feeling financially stretched. So instead of progress, what you get is hesitation. And hesitation, when it lasts long enough, starts to feel like refusal. That's when frustration begins to replace hope. And frustration always needs somewhere to go. Over time, Coyote Pass becomes less of a shared goal and more of a shared argument. Every update feels like a reminder of what hasn't happened yet. Every plan becomes another version of the same conversation that never seems to resolve. And underneath it all is an uncomfortable truth nobody says directly at first. If this was really going to happen, wouldn't it have started by now? That question hangs in the background of everything. Meanwhile, life outside the land is not standing still. The family itself is changing shape. Relationships that once held the structure together begin to weaken under distance, disagreement, and years of unresolved tension. And that matters, because Coyote Pass only works as a symbol if the family itself stays intact. The moment the unity starts breaking down, the land stops being a shared future and starts becoming a problem that needs to be solved. At that point, the emotional meaning of the property begins to shift again. It is no longer our future home site. It starts becoming an asset. And that shift from dream to asset is one of the most important turning points in this entire story. Because an asset doesn't ask how you feel. An asset asks what it's worth. And once that question enters the conversation, everything changes. Now the land has to be measured, divided, accounted for. Who put in what? Who holds what legal stake? What happens if the family doesn't stay together long enough to actually build anything on it? These are not emotional questions anymore. They are structural ones. And slowly, the foundation of the entire idea begins to crack, not physically, but financially and legally. And once that happens, the dream of Coyote Pass stops being something they are building toward and starts becoming something they might eventually have to sell. Once a shared dream turns into a financial question, the outcome usually stops being about unity and starts being about resolution. And in the case of Coyote Pass, resolution didn't come through building. It came through waiting. Waiting for years while the land stayed untouched. Waiting while conversations repeated themselves in different forms, but led to the same dead ends. Waiting while the family itself continued to evolve in ways the original plan never accounted for. Because Coyote Pass was designed for a version of the family that assumed permanence. It was built on the idea that the structure of the marriage system would remain stable long enough for construction to even begin. But stability is exactly what started to disappear. And the longer nothing happened on the land, the more it started to represent something uncomfortable, stalled in tension. Not failure in one moment, but failure stretched across time. And that kind of failure is harder to ignore because it doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds slowly, quietly, until it becomes impossible to pretend it's still on track. Inside the family, that slow stall creates a divide between expectation and reality. On one side is what was promised, a unified property where everyone would eventually live together in a coordinated, shared space. On the other side is what is actually happening, separate lives, separate households, separate priorities. And those two versions of reality begin to drift further and further apart. At some point, even planning sessions about the land stop feeling productive. They start feeling repetitive. The same questions come up again and again. Where should each home go? How should the property be divided? What is financially realistic? And each time, the answers feel less certain than before. Because underneath all of those logistical questions is a deeper one that nobody can fully avoid anymore. Is this still actually going to happen? And once that question becomes central, every discussion about Coyote Pass starts to feel heavier. Not because the land itself has changed, but because belief in the land has changed. And belief is what was holding it together. Meanwhile, financial reality continues to press in. Large-scale construction on undeveloped land is expensive under the best circumstances. But when a family is also managing multiple households, shifting relationships, and uneven income dynamics, the pressure increases significantly. Plans that once felt exciting begin to feel impractical. Ideas that once felt visionary start to feel delayed. And delay, over time, starts to feel like avoidance. That's when something subtle but important happens. The land stops being talked about as a guaranteed future and starts being discussed as a possible outcome. That shift in language matters. Because "we will build here" becomes "if we build here." And once "if" enters the conversation, certainty is already gone. Around the same time, the emotional structure of the family is also changing. The unity that once gave meaning to shared decisions is weakening. Distance grows. Communication becomes more complicated. Priorities begin to separate. And Coyote Pass, instead of bringing everyone together, starts highlighting how far apart they already are. What was supposed to be the center of the family becomes, slowly, the thing that exposes its fractures. And once that exposure happens, the land can no longer function as a dream. It has to function as something else. A question. A cost. A decision that has been delayed long enough that eventually, it cannot be delayed anymore. Because no matter how long a plan is talked about, there comes a point where the absence of action becomes its own answer. And Coyote Pass was approaching that point quietly, steadily, without anyone needing to announce it out loud. The land was no longer just waiting to be built on. It was waiting to be dealt with. And when something sits long enough in that to be dealt with stage, it eventually stops feeling like a project and starts feeling like a burden. That's what Coyote Pass became. Not overnight, not in a single decision, but through years of accumulation. Unused plans, repeated discussions, shifting priorities, and an increasing awareness that what was supposed to happen on that land was no longer aligned with what was actually happening in the family. Because by the time the idea of building was still being talked about, the family itself was already living in a different reality. Separate households were no longer a temporary arrangement. They had become permanent structures of life. Distance wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional, financial, and relational. And that changes everything about how you look at shared property. At first, Coyote Pass was framed as the ultimate equalizer. A place where 4 wives would have equal space, equal homes, equal footing. It was supposed to be the physical proof that no one was above anyone else. But equality on paper and equality in practice are not the same thing. And the longer the land remained undeveloped, the more those differences started to surface. Because equal ownership of a dream doesn't guarantee equal ability to execute it. Some people are in stronger financial positions. Some have more influence in decision-making. Some have legal structures that give them more protection if things go wrong. And those differences don't stay invisible forever. They eventually show up in outcomes. So while the land itself stayed unchanged, the meaning attached to it kept shifting. What started as our shared future slowly turned into a complicated shared asset. And that change in language is not cosmetic, it reflects a deeper transformation in how the family understood itself. Because once something becomes an asset, it becomes measurable. And once it becomes measurable, it becomes divisible. And once it becomes divisible, the question is no longer what are we building together? It becomes who gets what if we don't? That question changes the entire emotional temperature of the situation. Now every discussion about Coyote Pass carries an undertone of uncertainty. Not just about construction, but about continuity. Whether the family structure that purchased the land will still exist in the same form by the time anything actually gets built. And slowly, that uncertainty becomes the defining feature of the property. Meanwhile, the rest of life continues moving forward. Relationships shift. Commitments weaken or dissolve. New realities take shape that no longer revolve around a shared physical space. And in that environment, holding on to undeveloped land becomes more than just a logistical issue, it becomes a question of purpose. What is this land now, if not a future we no longer seem to be building toward? That question doesn't always get answered directly. Instead, it gets answered indirectly through inaction, through delay, through shifting attention elsewhere. But silence is also a form of communication. And in the case of Coyote Pass, silence eventually said more than any meeting ever could. Because the absence of construction became proof of something deeper, that the original vision was no longer functioning as intended. And once that realization settles in, the land stops being a shared dream waiting for construction and starts becoming a shared problem waiting for resolution. And at that point, only one question remains inevitable. If the dream is no longer alive, what happens to what's left of it? That question, what happens to what's left of it, is where Coyote Pass stops being a story about land and starts becoming a story about unraveling. Because when a shared vision collapses, it doesn't disappear cleanly. It leaves behind structure, paperwork, ownership records, financial entanglements that were designed for a future that never arrived. And that's where things get complicated. Coyote Pass wasn't just an emotional investment, it was a legal one. Multiple names, multiple claims, multiple expectations tied to one physical piece of property. And as long as the family remained aligned, those complexities could be ignored or worked around. But alignment is fragile when the underlying relationship structure begins to break down. Once distance grows between people who once made decisions together, even simple questions become complicated. Who decides what gets built? Who pays for what? Who benefits if nothing gets built at all? And most importantly, who has the final say if the shared vision no longer feels shared? These are not abstract questions. They become urgent the moment trust begins to weaken. Because shared property only works smoothly when shared intention still exists. Without that, every decision starts to feel like negotiation instead of cooperation. And negotiation inside a fractured system always carries tension. So as time passes, Coyote Pass slowly transforms from a future build site into something much more uncertain. Not just undeveloped land, but unresolved ownership. And unresolved ownership is where legal structure begins to matter more than emotional history. This is the point where the difference between what was intended and what is documented becomes critical. Because intention can say one thing, this was meant for all of us equally, but documentation can reflect something entirely different. Who is listed where? Who holds legal rights? Who has enforceable claims if the property is sold instead of built on? And those details, often ignored during the hopeful phase of a project, become everything once the hopeful phase ends. Meanwhile, inside the family, the emotional meaning of the land continues to erode. What once represented unity now represents delay. What once symbolized shared life now symbolizes unresolved conflict. And the longer it sits untouched, the harder it becomes to treat it as a future home site rather than a financial asset stuck in limbo. At a certain point, that shift is no longer subtle. It becomes the dominant reality. Because you can't keep calling something a dream if no one is actively building it anymore. And that's where the pressure builds toward an unavoidable conclusion. Something has to change. Either the plan is revived with real, coordinated action, or the plan is abandoned in favor of resolution. But staying in the middle, between intention and execution, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Because time doesn't pause for unfinished projects. And Coyote Pass had already spent years in that unfinished state. So even without a dramatic announcement, the direction of the story was becoming clear. Not because someone declared it over, but because nothing was being done to keep it alive. And in situations like this, inaction eventually becomes a decision in itself. A quiet one, but a final one nonetheless. And once that quiet decision sets in, once inaction becomes the default, it changes how everyone looks at the land. Coyote Pass is no longer a shared plan with a timeline attached. It becomes something sitting in the background of every other decision, like a question that never fully goes away. Because even when it isn't being actively discussed, it still exists. It still carries ownership. It still carries cost. And it still carries the weight of what it was supposed to become. That lingering presence is what makes it impossible to ignore completely. At this stage, the conversation around the property shifts again. It's no longer about how to build. It's not even about when to build. It becomes about whether building is still realistic at all. And that's a very different kind of conversation. Because how and when assume the destination is still intact. Whether questions the destination itself. That shift doesn't happen loudly. It happens gradually, through hesitation, through revised expectations, through repeated delays that start to feel less like obstacles and more like signals. And as that shift continues, the emotional connection to the land weakens. Not because people stop caring, but because caring without progress becomes exhausting. Meanwhile, the financial reality of the situation continues to sit underneath everything. Raw land without development does not become simpler over time. It becomes more defined in its limitations. Costs remain. Property responsibilities remain. Legal entanglements remain. And when a project stops moving forward, those fixed realities start to outweigh the original vision. This is where Coyote Pass begins to lose its identity as a future home site and starts to solidify as a long-term asset decision. And asset decisions are never just emotional decisions. They are structural ones. They require clarity about ownership, value, and outcome. And they force conversations that were once delayed to finally be addressed directly. Because at some point, every shared asset reaches a fork in the road. Either it gets built into what it was meant to be, or it gets converted into something else entirely. And when families are no longer functioning as a unified decision-making unit, that fork becomes even sharper. What makes Coyote Pass especially significant in this story is that it was supposed to be the ultimate proof of unity. A physical place where differences would dissolve into shared living. But instead of dissolving differences, the land highlighted them. Different levels of investment. Different levels of influence. Different interpretations of fairness. Different emotional connections to what the land actually represented. And over time, those differences stop being theoretical and start influencing real-world outcomes. Even the idea of selling the land, which would have once felt like abandoning a dream, begins to shift into something more practical. A form of closure. Because unresolved projects have a way of draining attention indefinitely. They sit in the background, asking for decisions that never quite get made. And eventually, the question becomes not what should we build here, but why are we still holding on to this? That is the quiet turning point. Not a dramatic confrontation, just a gradual shift in necessity. And once necessity takes over, sentiment begins to lose ground. Because you can delay a dream for a while, but you can't delay reality forever. And Coyote Pass, after years of waiting, was starting to move into the space where reality always wins. And when reality finally starts to win, it doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It shows up as a series of practical decisions that slowly replace emotional ones. That's exactly what begins to happen around Coyote Pass. The conversations that once centered on building what kind of homes, where they would sit, how the family would live together, start to fade into something more procedural. Less about vision, more about logistics. Less about our future, more about what do we do with this now? Because once a shared project stops progressing, it eventually becomes something that has to be managed instead of dreamed about. And management is never romantic. It's structured. It's financial. It's based on outcomes, not intentions. At this point, the land is no longer carrying the same emotional weight it once did. That doesn't mean it's meaningless. It means its meaning has changed. What used to represent unity now represents a paused investment. A frozen plan. A decision that was made years ago but never fully completed. And unfinished decisions tend to accumulate pressure over time. Especially when life continues moving forward in other areas. The family itself is no longer standing still. Relationships evolve. Priorities shift. Distance becomes normal instead of temporary. And as those changes settle in, it becomes harder and harder to justify holding on to a shared vision that no longer matches shared reality. Because shared reality is the key phrase here. A project like Coyote Pass only works when everyone involved is still operating from the same version of what we are building together. Once those versions diverge, the foundation weakens. And when the foundation weakens, the structure above it, no matter how meaningful it once was, starts to lose stability. So the land remains, but its role changes again. It stops being a destination and becomes an obligation that needs to be resolved at some point in the future. And obligations have a way of resurfacing, even when they're pushed aside. Meanwhile, financial clarity becomes more important than emotional narrative. At this stage, it's no longer enough to remember what was intended. What matters now is what is legally recorded, what is financially viable, and what can actually be executed if action is finally taken. That's where tension often exists in situations like this, between the story people told themselves when they bought something and the reality they face when they finally have to exit it. Because exit is inevitable in stalled projects. Even if delayed, it always returns as an option. And once selling enters the conversation, even quietly, it changes the emotional temperature of everything. Because selling is not just a transaction in this context. It's a conclusion. It turns, we are going to build something together into, we are done building together. And that shift carries weight far beyond numbers on a page. At the same time, the idea of fairness becomes more complicated. What does fairness look like when contributions were unequal, when legal structures differ, when emotional investment doesn't match financial ownership? Those questions don't have simple answers. They rarely do in situations where family, money, and long-term planning overlap. And that complexity is part of why the situation lingers as long as it does. Because every potential solution creates another question. But eventually, even complexity reaches a limit. Because unresolved systems don't stay suspended forever. They either get rebuilt or they get resolved. And Coyote Pass, after years of sitting in that suspended space, was approaching the point where resolution could no longer be avoided. Not because the families suddenly agreed, but because the land itself had reached the end of what it could realistically represent. And when that happens, the only direction left is forward, whether everyone is ready for it or not. And moving forward, in this case, didn't mean building. It meant letting go. Because once a shared asset like Coyote Pass reaches the point where development is no longer realistic, the only remaining path is resolution through division, typically sale, distribution, and legal closure. But even that process isn't simple when the original structure was built on a mix of legal ownership, informal understanding, and emotional expectation. That's where things become delicate. Because what each person believes they are entitled to and what the paperwork actually supports are not always aligned. And in situations like this, paperwork is what ultimately governs outcomes. Not memories. Not intentions. Not even long-standing beliefs about fairness. And that's where the emotional weight of the situation becomes unavoidable. Because for years, Coyote Pass represented something bigger than land. It represented a promise. A physical manifestation of unity. A future that was supposed to be shared equally across 4 separate households. But when the dream doesn't materialize, the promise doesn't just disappear, it gets converted into something measurable. Value. Equity. Distribution. And that conversion is where the emotional story meets the financial one. At this stage, the land is no longer about what it could have been. It is about what it is worth now. And that shift alone is enough to change the entire tone of the conversation. Because once value becomes the focus, comparison becomes unavoidable. Who contributed what? Who holds which portion? Who has legal standing that translates into a larger share if the asset is liquidated? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones when a shared investment reaches its final stage. And this is where the reported outcomes begin to draw attention. Because when the numbers eventually surface, they don't just reflect a sale, they reflect a structure that was in place long before the sale ever happened. Reported figures suggesting uneven distribution don't appear out of nowhere. They tend to mirror the underlying ownership arrangements that were established when the property was first acquired and developed on paper, not on land. And that distinction is important. Because fairness in outcome is often determined long before the outcome arrives, inside the agreements, titles, and legal frameworks that shape what each person is actually entitled to if things don't go as planned. So when people look at the final payout and compare amounts, what they are really seeing is not just the result of a sale, they are seeing the result of a system that was designed at the beginning of the journey. Meanwhile, emotionally, the impact is very different. Because even if everything is legally correct, even if every number is justified on paper, the feeling of imbalance can still exist when expectations were built around equality. And that gap between expectation and outcome is where disappointment lives. especially in families where unity was not just assumed, but actively promoted as the foundation of the entire structure. So when the land is finally converted into cash, it doesn't just end a property arrangement. It exposes the difference between what was promised emotionally and what was protected legally. And those two things are not always the same. Which brings the story to a quiet but powerful realization. Coyote Pass didn't just divide land. It revealed how that land was already divided from the very beginning. And once that realization settles in, the story of Coyote Pass stops feeling like a single event and starts feeling like a pattern that was unfolding all along. Because the final sale didn't create inequality, it exposed it. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. The land didn't become unevenly distributed at the end. The structure that produced the final distribution was already in place long before any checks were written, long before any figures were reported, and long before anyone started comparing outcomes. By the time the property was sold, the outcome had already been shaped by years of decisions, legal, financial, and relational, that determined how ownership actually functioned inside the family. And that's what makes situations like this so difficult to simplify. Because from the outside, it's easy to look at final numbers and assume they represent a single moment of decision. But in reality, they're the endpoint of a long chain of smaller decisions that gradually define who holds what kind of power, responsibility, and legal standing. Coyote Pass is just where that chain became visible. And once it became visible, it naturally raised questions. Why were ownership structures set up the way they were? Why did certain legal positions carry more weight than others? Why did a shared dream depend so heavily on arrangements that weren't equal in practice? These questions don't always have satisfying answers, especially in complex family systems where personal relationships and legal frameworks overlap in uneven ways. But they matter because they explain why outcomes don't always match expectations. And expectations are really the core issue here. Because this was never just about land. It was about belief. The belief that 4 separate lives could still function as one unified structure. The belief that shared vision would naturally lead to shared results. The belief that emotional equality would translate into material equality over time. But belief alone doesn't determine outcomes. Structures do. And Coyote Pass was built inside a structure where those beliefs were not fully supported by equal legal foundations. So when the asset is finally liquidated, the result doesn't reflect how people felt about the arrangement. It reflects how the arrangement was actually constructed. That difference is where the tension comes from. Because emotionally, the expectation of fairness remains powerful. But legally, fairness is defined differently. It is defined by ownership shares, documented contributions, and enforceable agreements. And when those two versions of fairness don't align, the gap becomes the story. Not just in this family, but in many situations where shared assets are built on informal trust rather than equally distributed legal frameworks. And that's why Coyote Pass continues to generate discussion even after it's been sold. Because it represents more than a piece of land. It represents a case study in what happens when emotional unity and legal structure don't evolve at the same pace. One is based on belief. The other is based on record. And when the two collide, the record always wins in the end. So by the time the dust settles, what remains isn't just a financial outcome. It's a clearer picture of how the system was built from the start and who that system was ultimately designed to protect more strongly than others. And that's why the conversation doesn't end with the sale. It ends with the question the sale makes impossible to ignore. Was the equality ever real in structure, or only ever real in story? That question, whether the equality was ever real in structure or only real in story, is really where Coyote Pass stops being about land altogether. Because by this point, the property itself is no longer the main subject. It has already done its job. It has already been purchased, held, debated, delayed, and finally sold. What remains now is interpretation. And interpretation is where the real conflict always lives. Because depending on how you look at it, Coyote Pass can tell two completely different stories. On one hand, you can see it as a straightforward legal outcome. A shared property acquired under specific ownership arrangements, eventually sold according to those arrangements, with payouts reflecting documented stakes, contributions, and legal standing. In that reading, the numbers are not emotional, they are structural. They are simply the result of how the system was set up from the beginning. But on the other hand, you can see something very different. You can see a shared dream that was repeatedly described as equal, as unified, as balanced, yet never fully supported by equal execution in practice. A dream that required harmony to function, but was built on a foundation where harmony itself was constantly under pressure. And when those two perspectives collide, you get the tension that surrounds this story. Because both things can be true at the same time, the outcome can be legally explainable and still emotionally unsettling. That's the space Coyote Pass occupies in the public conversation, not as a simple case of numbers, but as a reflection of how families manage shared ambition when the underlying structure isn't perfectly aligned. And in that sense, the land becomes symbolic in a way that goes far beyond its acreage. It becomes a mirror. A mirror showing how trust, ownership, and expectation can drift apart over time without anyone necessarily noticing the exact moment it happens. Because there usually isn't one moment. There are many small ones. Delays, decisions, adjustments, compromises that feel minor at the time but accumulate into something much larger when viewed in hindsight. And by the time the final sale happens, those accumulated choices are already embedded in the outcome. So the checks don't just represent a sale price. They represent the final shape of a structure that was forming for years. That's why comparisons feel so emotionally charged. Because people are not just comparing money, they are comparing meaning. They are comparing what was promised versus what was delivered. What was believed versus what was recorded. What was hoped for versus what actually held up under legal and financial pressure. And that gap is where all the debate lives. Some will always argue the numbers are simply the result of formal ownership. Others will always point to the history of uneven experiences and conclude that the structure itself was never truly equal. But what neither side can deny is that Coyote Pass reveals something important about how fragile shared visions can be when they depend on systems that are not equally weighted from the start. Because unity is not just an idea. It has to be built into the framework that supports it. Otherwise, it remains vulnerable to time, change, and the very legal realities that eventually bring every unfinished arrangement to its conclusion. And that is what this story ultimately comes down to. Not just who got what, but how long a shared dream can survive when the structure underneath it is slowly pulling in different directions. Coyote Pass was meant to prove unity. In the end, it proved something else entirely. It proved that when a dream is finally converted into numbers, those numbers don't just end the story, they explain it.